Hello, everyone. I hope that you're having a wonderful and peaceful seventh day of rest. Um, Today, I'd like to talk about sacrifices. Um, Back in, we'll say, the days of Moses, on up until the temple was destroyed in Jerusalem, with the exception of a few years. I'm not sure if the sacrifices continued in the 70-year captivity while a lot of Israel was in Babylon and whatnot. The daily sacrifices, the special sacrifices and offerings and whatnot that were made. But there's a common misconception, misunderstanding, false belief in today's society, even among Torah observant people or communities, or however you want to refer to those who strive to observe Yahweh's Torah, that the sacrifice or the sacrificial system has been done away with. That just simply is not true. Now, one of the common defenses against that false belief is that there's no temple and there's no altar, so there's nowhere to sacrifice, and that is a valid argument. Another argument that's used is that only priests were allowed to sacrifice, and this also is true to a point. Abraham made sacrifices and offerings. I'm not sure if Isaac did, I don't remember, but Jacob also made sacrifices himself. And while they weren't priests, there's a view that they technically were the priest of the family because the Levites came out of them. So, in kind of a retrospect sort of way, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were the priests of the family. At the very least, they were certainly the leaders, the patriarchs. But there's another aspect that I don't believe I've ever heard anyone approach the false doctrine of the sacrifices are done away with. And that is Yeshua is the perfect sacrifice, right? So let me make a little analogy right quick, and I realize that my analogy is not going to be perfect, but matter of fact, I'm going to make a couple of analogies here, maybe even more than a couple. But how, and not being racist or anything like that, just simply speaking of historical fact, but the Native Americans, hundreds of years ago, they hunted with traps, probably to start with. Dig pits or use the little rope with a slip knot to snatch something up into a tree and stuff like that. I don't know how they hunted before the concept of the first spear came along. And the first spear was a sharpened stick, a stick with a point on the end of it. And then some Native American somewhere one day discovered that there's a certain type of rock that if you chipped at it a certain way, it would become sharp. get sharp edges on it. And they discovered and learned how to shape those rocks so that it would have a sharp point on the end of their spear, and they could shape the back end of the rock in such a way that they could lash it to the stick that they were attaching it to. They would use vines or animal sinew or rawhide or something other like that to lash their sharpened rock to the end of the stick. Well, then some Native American somewhere figured out and discovered how to make a bow, like for bow and arrows. And the first arrows were what? They were sharpened sticks. Alright, and then they figured out, I don't know which order they figured these things out in, but the first arrows were relatively crude devices. It was literally just a sharpened stick. They didn't fly straight very well or anything like that. Well, then, I'm sure still Native American discovered, maybe not even Native American, maybe all this stuff happened back in, ancient Middle East, I don't know when. But it was discovered that you could take and fasten feathers to the back of your sharpened stick, and they're called flights, by the way. At least on modern arrows. I'm not sure how they referred to them back then, but what it did is it acted like a drag. So you could throw it sideways, and the flights or the drag would create enough air resistance to straighten it up and keep it flying in a straight direction. Well, and at some point they discovered that you could take a sharpened rock similar to the one tied to the spears and put it on the end of an arrow. And that also helped maintain the straight flight and whatnot. And then at some point someone discovered that if you tied the flights or the feathers on the back of the arrow with a slight twist to them, it would cause the arrow to rotate or spiral, which stabilized it even further. And then, you go from bows and arrows to firearms. And then there's a whole evolution of firearms. You had the funnel end muskets, and then they went to regular muskets, and then they discovered riflings and an elongated projectile and stuff like that, but they were still muzzle loaders. Well, then they go from muzzle loaders to cartridge type propellant projectiles, and so there's a whole evolution of firearms up into the modern firearms that we have in the world today. Alright, well, for all intents and purposes, not being able to see the future or anything like that, we have reached the pinnacle of long distance firearms, or the means and methods for extended distance projectiles. And it's irrelevant what they're used for. Some people use them for bad, nefarious purposes, and other people use them still for the purpose that I think Yahweh originally allowed them for, was hunting and providing for ourselves. So why would we go back to a sharpened stick to try to hunt for our food, And in the cases of war, why would we go back to a sharpened stick to fight battles with when we have the modern firearms that we have? And to use that analogy, that timeline, the modern firearm that we have is perfect compared to the sharpened stick and all the evolution that led up to the modern firearm. And no, I know they're not perfect. They still have problems. They wear out and break and stuff like that. But, analogously speaking, they're perfect compared to the original sharpened stick. So, using that comprehension, understanding, since Yeshua is the perfect sacrifice, why would you go back? Why would anybody want to go back to sacrificing animals? And Scripture says that Yeshua is the perfect sacrifice. I don't know where. I'll try to remember to put scriptural references in the description under the video. But Scripture also says that the blood of animals only covered sin, and the blood sacrifice of Yeshua Messiah washes sin away. So we are still under the sacrificial system. It's just that Yeshua is the perfect sacrifice that covers the need for all other sacrifices. So why is anybody confused about that? Why would anybody think that there is some sort of need to go back to animal sacrifices? And beyond that, why is it hard for people to understand just because we're not sacrificing animals on an altar in the temple in Jerusalem? Why would they think that the sacrificial system is done away with? Because every time someone who is every time a child of Yahweh commits sin, once that sin is repented of, then the sacrifice of Yeshua Messiah washes that sin away. So, doesn't that mean that we are actually still under the sacrificial system? It's just that we have now the perfect sacrifice. And I said something about two analogies, so let's get on to another one here. People didn't used to build houses the way that we build houses now. Now we have lots of different ways to build houses. Now, personally, I'm wanting to build me a metal building on a cement slab and frame up a wooden living structure inside of it. And I see that coming. Yahweh willing, it's going to happen sooner rather than later. But, what used to happen was they would just take and pile up mud. You pile up a little row of mud and you let it dry, and then you pile up another little row of mud on it and you let it dry until eventually you have built a mud wall for all intents and purposes. And then for the roof, you had these fronds that were made out of straw and grass and hay and stuff like that were all laid parallel with one another and then laid on the top in such a way that the way fronds actually work is it creates a surface for the water to stick to and run down. So they weren't actually waterproof, they just used water direction. I don't know how to explain it, but you know how if you take a piece of grass and you dip it in water and you hold it up, even if you hold it at an angle, the water droplets will run down the grass and drip off the end. And that's what fronds did. The water, when it rained on it, would run down the fronds and drip onto the next ones and run down and the next ones and so forth and so on until it got to the fronds that were hanging off the edge and flip. I think they were called fronds. I may be wrong. Well, then we go from fronds, and then they start framing up structures with wood. They weren't boards so much as they were timbers. And then they would attach things to the timbers to make your walls, and, they went to... Sorry, I got a spider web here that just won't go away. Sure you know how aggravating they can be, especially when they catch you right across the face. But they went from timber frames to stick framed houses, using, I'm going to say modern milled lumber, although modern milled lumber is still a relatively new thing within the past 50, 60, 100 years or so, where they run it through planers and stuff like that, and the lumber that you buy now is smooth and slick. It's not rough sawn anymore, and they have a pretty standard dimension system nowadays, which is also more improvements. And they went from fronds to clay tiles and, well, different parts of the world. And then there were cedar shakes, which is the predecessor to our modern asphalt shingles. So building technology has come that far. Why would we turn around and go back to living in mud huts, instead of the stick framed houses that we live in nowadays? That's kind of backwards, isn't it? So too is going back to sacrificing animals when we have the perfect sacrifice already made, Yeshua Messiah. And I've got bunches of other analogies that I could throw out to illustrate my point, but I'm pretty confident that I've made it. I apologize for the rambling nature of this video, and I also apologize for continuing to look off. I got the sun shining right in my eyes. So if you have any questions at all, feel free to ask them in the comment section. If you think that anything I've said is maybe inaccurate, wrong, or anything like that, certainly by all means comment. But remain respectful. I'd love to see some conversation going on. But other than that, remember Proverbs 18:13, and more importantly than that is Acts chapter 17 verses 10 and 11, which reminds us that even if we do listen to a preacher or a teacher of some sort, it's still up to us to search it out. And 2 Timothy chapter 2 verse 15 is pretty much the same thing. You have to study to show yourself approved. No one else can do it for you. Other than that, I hope to see everyone in the kingdom of heaven, and Yahweh bless.